Ralph Nader first sprang to the public eye in the United States as a young lawyer in 1966 when he published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, which turned out to be a massive indictment of the American motor industry's unwillingness to consider the safety of their vehicles, and indeed the particular inherent lack of safety of one car. That was the Chevrolet Corvair made by General Motors, and that was ultimately withdrawn for sale. From sale, as the sales had collapsed after the publication of the book. Well, since then, Ralph Nader has become the best-known consumer in the world, if you like, the world's toughest customer. You've been called that, Ralph Nader. What, in fact, do you do when something goes wrong with something that you've bought, or don't you ever buy anything?
Well, I don't buy very many things, but whenever there's a product that one purchases or a service, follow what I preach, of course, is to make sure that it's given adequate warranty, given adequate backup. For example, if buy a typewriter. I buy typewriters because we use typewriters. And the first thing that the company wants to do is sell us a service contract, which in effect is saying to us, well, things are going to go wrong, so why don't you pay $50 a year just to cover the service contract? And you have to make things very clear right at the beginning that if you don't think you as a consumer are in the driver's seat, then you're going to be eaten alive by the sellers, because they spend 20 hours a day figuring out how they're going to maneuver around you.
You really believe that?
No, of course. I mean, that's their business. Their business is to outdo you. It's kind of a game, an adversary process. The problem is that the consumers usually give up before they even think of trying, while the sellers and the manufacturers are figuring out how are they going to advertise it, how are they going to make the pictures look just right, how are they going to cover up the deficiencies of the product, and so forth. This is true, of course, as far as consumers' attitude toward doctors, dentists, and lawyers. I mean, I've asked people in the United States how many of them go to dentists that put lead aprons over them when they take an X-ray, and 3 out of 4 people say that their dentist refuses to put lead aprons, which is an ordinary procedure according to proper dental practice. And I say to them, well, now that you know that this should be done, next time you go to the dentist, will you ask the dentist to put a lead apron over you pursuant to an X-ray? And they all say, well, gee, that'll make the dentist angry.
And then he'll hurt me when he drills the tooth.
And I don't want to, rupture the relationship and the smiles and the charming aura. Well, basically, customers are intimidated. They're intimidated by automated, robot-type, over-professional, plastic-type procedures.
It's interesting that you brought up radiation then, because I know that's been the subject of one of your campaigns, but looking back over the years, and you've been, if you like, really the consumer industry in America since 1966, which of your campaigns have you been the most proud of?
Well, the automobile one, in terms of an actual change. I mean, fatalities in the United States and on highways have dropped. The projection in 1966 that by 1976, there would be between 75 and 80,000 people killed every year on the highway. And the projection actually now is for about 47,000. And a good deal of that is due to more crash-worthy cars, more seatbelts, shoulder harnesses, padded dash panels, stronger door latches.
The whole question of secondary safety.
Yes, that's right.
Now, your latest campaign is what I suppose the press would describe as a vicious attack on multinational corporations. Now, which corporations are you trying to tame and why?
Well, first of all, we think it's a prudent attack on excessive multinational corporate power. You see, I don't think political democracy years ago anticipated the rise of giant corporations like Exxon and Texaco, and General Motors and Ford and ITT, spanning nations, able to manipulate governments and play one nation off against another and engage in transfer pricing in order to pay fewer taxes in one country compared to another, affecting the environment, polluting the seas and the oceans and the land and the air, monopolizing markets. These are very real situations. People say, well, how big are these corporations? Well, Exxon grosses $4.5 million an hour, 24 hours a day. Exxon's gross revenues are as large as the country of Mexico's gross national product.
But nevertheless, multinational corporations like that surely provide employment for large numbers of people. They create wealth for countries. They can't be all bad.
Well, the question is, can we have better alternatives? And the penalties of permitting multinational corporations to continue beyond and above and against the law, unbridled power, is that often there's very little innovation and even less efficiency. They're big bureaucracies like often government agencies are. For instance, the energy producers, the large oil companies, are not interested in developing solar energy because solar energy will replace their great investments in fuels, and because nobody can own the sun. They can't own the sun. They can't control supply. They can't deal in cartels.
They can't have a piece of the action, in fact.
That's right. So that solar energy in all its manifestations, really, which is going to be the future energy source of the world. It has to be, because we don't have any alternatives after a century or so of depletion. It's blocked. In the United States, the oil companies have been very cool, if not obstructive, of solar energy development. They want to develop atomic power, uranium. They're into uranium. They're buying up coal mines. Of course, they're in oil and gas. Again, there's the question of the infliction of environmental violence on people. Millions of people in the United States and in the UK breathe the pollutants that give them cancer, that give them emphysema and other forms of lung disease. By what right?
This is actually happening in the UK, you're saying?
Of course. I mean, by what right do these corporations have to inflict silent cumulative violence that affects people's health and safety and future generations? Why should they use our air and water and soil for their private sewers in order to keep their profits at a higher level?
So what are you going to do about it? Close them down?
No. What we do is give victims the rights to initiate corrective action. Not only have government properly regulate them in terms of adequate taxation and consumer justice and pollution control, but to give individuals who are aggrieved because they've been defrauded or they've been polluted, or they've been pushed around, the rights to change the situation, to get compensation for their damages, to make corrections through the legal process. This is the whole theme of our book, Taming the Giant Corporation, that taxpayers who have to subsidize corporations, consumers who are defrauded by them, whether food and drugs, community residents who have to live with the terrible pollution and the hazards of industrial activities, they have to be given direct rights and remedies. They have to know what's going on. Corporations have to disclose a lot more of their information. People, for example, in the United States, they go and buy food. They don't even know what's in the food. They don't know what's in the meat that they buy, the processed meat. It's not labeled. And because that occurs, the meat companies are dumping high levels of fat and water and coloring additives and seasonings and preservatives and substandard meat that if people saw them being put in the processed meat, they'd never eat it.
But it sounds fine to say the public should have direct access, direct rights.
Yes.
But wouldn't you just be opening up the way for everyone with a tiny complaint to start storming the bastions of big companies and creating a lawyer's paradise?
No, because these complaints don't get anywhere, and the courts throw them out quite readily. The record is clear there. Furthermore, we have to go to the principal point. The principal point, if you or other people viewing the program are cheated in the marketplace, if they're harmed by pollution, if they're exposed to worker hazards and disease and get chemicals and gases in the workplace, if they are unfairly tapped to subsidize mismanaged corporations by the government. In other words, the government subsidizes corporations. They do so in the United States when they're in trouble, and they do so in the United Kingdom.
You're saying that the United Kingdom government should not have given money to Chrysler UK or to British Leyland?
Well, that's a case-by-case point. I mean, one can argue that you don't...
But is that an example?
Yes, that's an example. My point is that the taxpayers, the small taxpayers in Great Britain, shouldn't be automatic guarantors of big business mismanagement in Great Britain. That they should have the rights to raise the issue and say, why are you giving Chrysler this money? What is this money going to be used for? A year later, are we going to be able to audit these funds so they're not wasted? They're our tax money. We work hard for this money. At the present time in the United States, the United Kingdom, the taxpayers have no say. All they do is funnel the money. They are the final guarantors of corporate mismanagement.
Surely, if an MP was sitting here, wouldn't he say to you, but that is what Parliament is supposed to do. We, after all, are the representatives of the people. Are you saying that Congress in the United States and Parliament in this country have failed?
They are limited. They are delegated representatives of the people at best, and we all know that they can be susceptible to business influence and business cajolery and business corruption and business obstacles, and they can't do their job unless the citizens have a parallel pattern of rights and remedies themselves vis-a-vis these large corporations. Let me give you an illustration. What would people in Great Britain think if Parliament said, well, we are your delegated representatives and only we can engage in free speech? You've elected us and only we can engage in free speech. You have to, in effect, rely on us to play the marketplace of ideas. Well, people would be outraged. But in many areas, that is exactly what Parliament and what the government is saying to people. They're saying only the government will try to curb the pollution. Only the government will try to take out deceptive advertising from circulation. Well, our point in this book, Taming the Giant Corporation, is that the people have to have these rights. Consumer class actions, the right to challenge, the right to know, the right to disclosure, the right to organize themselves in their communities. Just like they have to have the right of free speech, and they can't delegate that to Parliament exclusively.
If these laws that you would like to bring in, or these availabilities of rights for consumers to affect big corporations, how would they actually affect consumers in the end? Wouldn't we end up with, in a world over here, for instance, where there would be less choice of product, or where products would be more expensive?
Not at all. First of all, there'd be more competition, so more real competition. Instead of food companies competing over the same product dressed up in different packages and brand names and colorful pictures, which aren't really of much value to consumers. They're trying to get the nutritional value in the food and the like. They'll be competing over real value, price, durability of the product, the extent of the warranty or the guarantee, the degree of repairability that's going to be accepted, and the safety of the product. Let me give you an illustration. Right now in the United States, people are spending billions of dollars for worthless drugs. Drugs that are supposed to put you to sleep or take care of your cold or do this or do that. They're totally worthless. Documented by the National Academy of Sciences repeatedly in one study after another, yet they're advertised on television. Great budgets go for these advertisements, and they're worthless. They're also pouring billions of dollars in more sophisticated drugs that are harmful, side effects that they're not told about. So with the kind of proposals that we're making, people would have an early alert system. They wouldn't have to wait until 10,000 thalidomide babies were born around the world, Western Europe in particular, because of a sedative that wasn't adequately tested. That these tests would be made public, they would be communicated immediately, and not just to a government agency which might sit on the test, but to in the public domain.
To some kind of independent organization.
Yes.
Yeah. Now,
not only an independent organization, but for example, the information would be put in public libraries so people could have access to this kind of thing. They're buying meat products. What's in the meat? What's in the processed meat? Is it 20% fat, 30% fat? Is it 10% added water? You see? In short, I think people in this country don't quite appreciate the need for full information. You cannot evaluate the products you buy, the service you receive from doctors and dentists, the kind of performance from government, unless there's total, full disclosure of information.
Maybe what we need over here is a Ralph Nader.
Well, I would suggest, first of all, that what you need are more civic organizations. You see, right now you're organized in one of three ways in this country: government, trade unions, and corporations. What you need are civic organizations, community, neighborhood organizations, consumer organizations, tax reform groups that are funded by the people in voluntary contributions so they can have their own full-time staff and they can produce a civic fiber for the rest of the country. Because if the country is only organized along special interest groups who have certain material purposes, then they're going to pretty much divide the power in the country up between them. They're not going to look out for the general interest. I mean, who looks out for the interest of all the people? Who looks out for the consumers?
Well, of course, the Consumers Association would say that they do. The National Consumers Council would say that they do.
To a small degree.
And so on.
They're underfunded.
We do have these groups.
Yes, they are underfunded. Which magazine's a good magazine, but it's primarily giving you information on various products. But it doesn't go to court, and it doesn't challenge, it doesn't lobby the Parliament. That's not its function. Many of the groups here in the United Kingdom are relatively small and inadequately funded. What I think needs to be done right across the board is to change that Official Secrets Act. You've got far too much government secrecy. I could give you examples of information that you don't have any right to know that in the United States we can get automatically. For example, the list of garages that have had their license suspended for poorly treating consumers. You can't get that in the United Kingdom. Would you believe that there's a 1957 report by the railroad companies here in England about the alleged safety of dumping human sewage on railroad tracks, and that is being withheld from the public, it's considered secret. The cost of the Concorde, that the taxpayers in this country, the small taxpayers footed, is considered secret. You can't have a fundamental political democracy with this kind of secrecy.
On a more personal level, Ralph Nader,
yes. Isn't that personal?
Well, yes. I suppose human waste probably is. But you yourself and your own organisations have been charged recently with being over-secretive about your own activities, your own funding, how many people you've got, and so on. When you demand openness from government and big corporations, what would you say to that?
That's, you see, totally wrong. And not only can I assert that, but I can tell you right now, for example, we have a $1.3 million budget. I can even break it down for you every year.
We haven't the time, but
yes,
I believe
but you see, the point is that these are kinds of claims made by people who are sympathetic to corporate interests, and they're just trying to paint a broad brush. But it's demonstrably wrong. We have nothing to hide, and we're very, very open. In fact, during the Nixon administration, when somebody said, well, were you wiretapped by the Watergate people and so forth? I said, well, I don't think we were, although in Washington you often are entitled to assume it. But if we were, fine. There's nothing to hide. Everything we do is out in the open.
So we could tap your telephones any time.
Other than the civil liberties problem, you're welcome.
Okay, let's go right back to the beginning.
Yes.
Before that famous book, Unsafe at Any Speed,
yes.
I believe you wrote an article at university called American Cars Designed for Death,
yes.
which really started the whole thing. What prompted you to take an interest in what was then a very unfashionable subject in the first place?
Well, I went to the Harvard Law School, and the Harvard Law School is very presumptuous and very arrogant. They think they're the best law school in the world, and they train bright law students to become tools for corporate power. And I rebelled against that when I was a student at the law school. It occurred to me that when we're studying auto accidents, why do we just study what I call driver-to-driver combat? You know, was this driver falling asleep, or was this driver careless that led to the accident, that raised the issue of who should be liable for the damages and the injuries? I began asking, what about the automobile? When people are in a crash, whether it's due to their own negligence or a bad tire or a bad road, that isn't what kills them. The first collision into a tree, let's say, or another car, isn't the proximate cause. The most proximate cause of the injury is a second collision, when the people in the car are thrown through the windshield or into the steering column or ejected through the door. And the degree of severity of the injury then depends on whether the car can absorb the energy in a collision adequately and protect people. Padded dash panels, collapsible steering columns, and the like. So I began inquiring. I'd write letters. I'd say, I'm a law student at Harvard, to General Motors and Ford and Chrysler. Please send me information. And they'd send me these colorful brochures that were, you could get at the auto dealership down the street. And I could never get enough information. So I got more and more interested in it because the more they shut the door, the more I wanted to find out what was going on. So I wrote a long paper for my third-year thesis, in effect, on automobile safety and the lack thereof. And that led to the article, and that led to the crusade on the whole issue, and led to the book in 1965, which in turn led to the passage of the federal auto safety law.
That, of course, resulted in safer cars.
Yes.
It's on record. But the car that really got clouted by Unsafe at Any Speed was a car called the Chevrolet Corvair. That's right, which was eventually withdrawn from sale, really largely because of that book. What would you say to the fact that in 1973, a U.S. Senate committee found that the Chevrolet Corvair compared favorably in stability and handling with contemporary compact cars of that era? Does that mean that you were wrong, or that you just picked one thing out and hammered away at it?
No, what it meant was that the Senate committee relied on a Department of Transportation report, which in turn was done by former auto industry people under a pro-industry Nixon administration. The report was very badly done. Our claim that the Corvair was unstable was in 1973 based on documents which we obtained from General Motors, internal documents, proving ground reports, which showed that GM in the early 1960s and late 50s was very concerned about the instability of the Corvair. A Ford Motor Company bought 2 early Corvairs, took them out to their proving grounds, and they rolled over on them with expert drivers. That wasn't the only case against the Corvair. of course, there's a problem of carbon monoxide leakage inside the passenger compartment, which General Motors admitted. How did they admit? Because they sent out letters twice to all Corvair owners warning them about the problem.
All right, well, that's one anti-Nader balloon deflated. But in 1971, you came over here and you had a real go at our British auto safety standards to the point when our Minister of Transport, the then Minister of Transport, John Payton, got rather cross with you, I believe.
Yes.
But at that time, we had a smaller number of road deaths per million vehicle miles travelled than you had in the United States.
No, that's not true.
Well, I have the 1968 figures right here, and we had 17.4 per million vehicle miles, and you had 17.8.
No, you'll see, we have the lowest fatality rate per 100 million vehicle miles traveled in the world.
Okay, let's leave it at that.
No.
Let's move on.
And of course, you have even more pedestrian deaths. And
Yes,
I can see why when I look at the streets in London.
Yeah, we have a greater traffic density and poor roads, perhaps. Would you make seatbelts compulsory in this country if you had the power to do so?
No, and here's why. I would make them compulsory on cars. You mean
but
compulsory
wearing of
usage?
seatbelts.
Yes. I wouldn't unless I was assured that the seatbelts that are in cars are protective of the entire physical spectrum, with few exceptions, of the population. And in the United States, and I'm speaking for the United States cars now, if you're short, if you're under 5 feet, for example, or 5'1", and if you happen to be very stout, or if you're a pregnant woman, you will have trouble using those seatbelts effectively. Instead, what we advocate are mandatory airbags, mandatory air cushions. These are the instantly inflated air cushion when you're in a crash, when I think most people would like to go into a pillow, in effect, during a crash, and then it deflates instantaneously. That not only covers 100% of the people, not just, unlike seatbelts, just the people who use them are protected by them, but it decelerates the hurtling occupant in the car in a much safer way.
And of course, tests have been going on with those for quite a long time.
Yes, there are 14,000 cars in the States that have these air cushions, and it's just a matter of politics now. If the Ford-Nixon administration were really friendly to consumers, they would have required these mandated air cushions about 3 years ago.
You see, going right back, including that whole business with General Motors and what you've just said about the Ford-Nixon administration being friendly towards consumers, I detect in Ralph Nader... Being unfriendly towards... I detect in your work a belief that a state of affairs truly exists in which government protective agencies, or indeed governments, are in a form of collusion with big corporations to the detriment of the consumer.
Well, if you don't want to use the word collusion, in some cases it is collusion, it's indentured status, or they surrender, or they're passive in terms of the government's responsibilities. Certainly. Look at the record. We've written many books on this subject. For example, members of Congress have to get elected. They need hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where do they get the money from? Business interests. Why do the business interests give them money? Because they get a quid pro quo in return later on.
It's a straight bribe.
I call it a bribe. That's right. I would eliminate private contributions in elections. I would have it all tax funded. You have a better system here in terms of access to media and so forth. But here's another example. The Federal Energy Administration is supposed to regulate oil and gas prices in the United States. 130 officials of the Federal Energy Administration are on leave, in effect, from the oil industry. They're oil industry officials. They go to the government for a few years, and then they go back to the oil companies at higher executive positions. We call it the Houston to Washington shuttle. So these are just some examples of how very close. And also, most people don't have money to challenge government or to push government for more consumer protection because they have to pay lawyers and lobbyists. But industry has the money. So there's an imbalance in pressure in Washington in favor of industry interests.
You see, looking at the list of some of the campaigns that you've espoused, you've looked at safety in mines, big industry, the meat packing industry, big industry, radioactivity and atomic energy, right down indeed to emissions from colour television sets. I know that's not radioactive.
Yes, it is.
It
That's
is.
radiation emissions from colour TV sets.
Monosodium glutamate in baby foods. I mean,
Yes.
was there really a conspiracy there between the baby food manufacturers and your Food and Drug Administration?
What there was the Food and Drug Administration didn't engage in the tests. It finally was pushed to action, not only by our efforts, but by a professor in Missouri who tested monosodium glutamate on baby mice and found brain damage. Of course, since monosodium glutamate has absolutely no nutritional value to babies, it has no benefit, why even allow that kind of risk? basically is put into baby food for the mother's purpose. You know, the baby food manufacturers are in effect say, if we can make the mother think the baby food tastes good, then let's give it to the baby. But up to about 7 months, the little infant has really no taste distinction.
Right. Now, do you think that in Great Britain we have a system of pressure groups and lobbyists anywhere near similar to what apparently exists on Capitol Hill or in Congress?
Yes, in some ways worse, because of the following. Your relations between business and government are even closer, more intertwined than ours. Secondly, your parliament doesn't engage in the kind of investigations that congressional committees engage in, and that leads to a great deal of publicity and helps consumer groups with information and to take action and to alert themselves. And thirdly, quite important, is that your courts are not as prone to overthrow business-oriented government decisions that are inimical to the consumer's interests. Your courts are not as assertive as our courts. Our courts, for example, can say, Food and Drug Administration, get this drug off the market because you've not been upholding the law here. Your courts are not as prone to do that. You have a much more passive court system.
Precedential system.
Well, it's not just precedential. It's just that traditionally the courts in England have not seen their purview, as being within their purview, the revocation of agency decisions.
Yeah. Now, you probably couldn't afford to come and live over here. If you did, and we have about 3 minutes left, what would your number one priority for consumers be?
Revoking the Official Secrets Act and government secrecy. I think without the right to know, without information about consumer fraud and worker hazards and taxpayer ripoffs, the sensitivity of consumers and citizens, their alertness, their willingness to realize that something is going on that's depriving them of their rights in order to mobilize for action is undermined.
Well, as we haven't got a Ralph Nader and we haven't got open congressional hearings as you have in the United States, what do we all do? Write to our MPs?
You have Thames TV. You have the ability to communicate to millions of people hard information about corporate crime and corruption and pollution. That's a good start. You can become the most active consumer advocate in England just by your access to all these millions of people watching these programs.
But don't you have a more lenient libel law system and slander law system in the United States?
Yes, that's
true.
Could
you have said about British industry and British organizations what you have said about American ones?
Yes. Well, I think the libel laws are stronger in this country in sort of deterring this kind of public criticism as far as individuals are concerned. When you're criticizing organizations or institutions, I think the argument that I hear in the United Kingdom that, well, the libel laws won't permit it is insubstantiated. That I think there is a distinction in the law between criticizing a product or a corporation or an agency, although it's more difficult to publicly criticize individuals here in England because of your excessively strict libel laws, which I think abridge of the freedom of speech that's necessary for a marketplace of ideas.
Some time back in Washington, I believe, one could buy badges that said Nader for president. And it's true that you've never run for any kind of elected office. Don't you feel you should have done?
No. I think that any democracy requires good people on the inside in government and good people on the outside who are alert. And I'm trying to help citizens all over the United States organize themselves so they can provide that civic backbone, that citizen backbone, so that people who do go in government aren't only surrounded by special interest lobbies and can do the right thing.
Finally, and very briefly, I was looking through your cuttings and I found a cartoon of you represented as a knight in shining armor on a horse, and you've just killed a car by plunging a lance through it. But now you're talking to the horse, and you're saying to him, you have poor traction, instability on curves, no rear visibility, a high center of gravity, and you eat too much. Haven't you really just become now a professional complainer?
No, I've become a consumer advocate. Everything that we treasure in our respective histories in England and the United States usually occurred because a few people blew the whistle, stood up, said something was wrong, and we're going to make it right. I'm sure there wasn't a mass majority behind the Magna Carta. We're glad we have it. So that's what I think we should look at. That's the way we should look at it. That basically the critic is the person who says something is wrong and here's how to make it right. And that's in the nature of human progress.
Ralph Nader, I have to stop you there.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed for coming along and blowing the whistle for us a few times today.
Thank you.
Take some shots for editing.
Continue talking.
I'll talk to you,
Yes,
so it's a
okay.
silent reaction. Thank you very much indeed.
I think it's
First
a good
of all, that was very good. And you just have about 4 minutes now, and we have a car waiting, so that you can go and see Mr. Ben. And I hope you will tell him to stop nationalising things. I'm getting rude words in my ear now. From
Serious. Not smiling. Now, but Mr. Nader, would you just talk to Tony for a
Yes.
minute about anything?
That's right.
What have you-
And we can't smile?
Tell
Hope
me,
I didn't embarrass
tell me a little
you
bit
by,
about the.
by saying that you could be the...
Tell me a bit about the Chevrolet Corvair.
Yes, actually, it was done in for a variety of reasons. One is the Mustang competition. Two is the dealers for GM didn't like it. There was a lot of trouble, repair, and so forth. And three, the criticism. But there were a number of reasons why they phased it out. So that was good that way. Do you do this program every? Do you do this program every day?
Every week.
Every week? Does it come on every day though, or just once a week? Once a week. That's
Tony,
it.
it's happy reaction, smile, I don't need it.
That's good.
All right.
That's it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.